d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5, knight c3, bishop b4, bishop g5, h6, bishop takes f6, queen takes f6, e3, castle kingside, rook c1, knight c6, queen b3, a5, a3, a4, queen c2, bishop a5, c takes d5, e takes d5, bishop e2, bishop f5, queen d1, knight e7, castle kingside, bishop takes c3, rook takes c3, queen b6, b4, a takes b3, rook takes b3, queen a7, queen d2, b6, rook c1, c5, d takes c5, b takes c5, rook bc3, c4, knight d4, bishop g6, h3, rook fb8, bishop f3, queen a5, knight e2, rook b3, knight f4, rook d8, knight takes g6, knight takes g6, rook d3, queen takes d2, rook takes d2, knight e5, rook cd1, c3, rook c2, rook takes a3, bishop takes d5, king f8, e4, knight c6, rook c1, rook c8, bishop takes c6, rook takes c6, rook d3, g5, rook c2, king e7, g4, king e6, f3, rook b3, king f1, rook c5, king e2, rook b2, rook takes b2, c takes b2, rook b3, rook c2, check, king d3, rook h2, king d4, king d6, rook b6, check, king c7, rook b3, king c6, rook b8, rook takes h3, Rook takes b2. Rook takes f3. Rook h2. Rook f6. King e5. Rook e6 check. King f5. King d6. Rook d2 check. King e7. e5. Rook a6. Rook h2. King f8. Rook h1. King g7. Rook f1. Rook b6. Rook f2. Rook b1. Rook f3. Rook b4. Rook f1. Rook b5. Rook a1. Rook b4. Rook f1. King f8. Rook f2. King e7. Rook f1. Rook b5. Rook a1. Rook b2. Rook f1. Rook a2. Rook f3. Rook a1. Rook f2. Rook e1. Rook f3. King f8. Rook f2. King g7. Rook f3. Rook a1. Rook f2. Rook a5. Rook b2. Rook c5. Rook a2. Rook c4. Rook f2. King f8. Rook f3. King e7. Rook f2. Rook d4. Rook f1. Rook a4. Rook f2. f6. E takes f6 check. King f7. Rook b2. Rook f4 check. King e5. Rook takes f6. Rook b4. King g6. Rook a4. Rook f7. Rook a6 check. King g7. Rook a8. King h7. Rook b8. King g7. Rook a8. Rook e7 check. King f5. Rook b7. King e4. Rook f7. King e5.